by 20-inch Belgian linen stretcher. Sketching freehand, I map out where Jesse and Horace are going to occupy space in the painting. I'm going to build this image up in zones, very similar to the way I'd paint a landscape or a normal portrait. So I'm going to begin with the background, and I'm using ultramarine blue, burnt umber, burnt sienna, and yellow oxide, and a little bit of quinacridone magenta. I want the main focus of the painting here to be the dogs, obviously, so I'm going to map out this area with big, broad brush strokes using a 1-inch bristle brush. I'm going to be working wet into wet, or alla prima, and my first pass is going to be covering as much area as possible with the same broad bristle brush that I used for the background. Now, despite the fact Jesse's fur looks black, it's a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. The combination of titanium white, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and quinacridone magenta. It's important to preserve tones with both our shadows and our highlights, so despite the fact some of these areas look bright white, I've held back somewhat and toned it down with burnt umber and ultramarine blue. I'm just trying to get a general indication of form and mass, and in some places a little bit of color. I'm able to get controlled lines by using this bristle wedge brush. I love painting alla prima because you can work directly into a wet paint surface and get all sorts of fantastic painterly effects. I'm adding some highlights to the nose and already the form's starting to emerge. My palette is really simple for this painting. Some warmer tones can be achieved by adding just a touch more burnt sienna, and this can be balanced with a cobalt blue and quinacridone magenta mix to get that nice blue reflected light off the snout. An old bristle brush dragged through the wet paint can give the indication of fur catching the light. And similarly, this can be used to add those silver hairs around the eyes. Yellow oxide and quinacridone magenta forms a rusty color for the base of the eye. This entire painting was painted in one sitting, so there's no layering of wet paint over a dry layer. After adding some minor details, I decided to move Jessie's snout out just a little bit more to really capture her character. It was just a little bit too short before. I reapply the highlight with pure titanium white, and whilst the brush is loaded, I add a glint to the eye. So the fur can be painted by dragging a bristle brush through the wet paint and into the background layer. We don't need a 000 sable rigger to get this wispy effect. I'm actually using a pretty big brush. I'm applying some more minor details to the eye by deepening the black in the pupil. I use some pretty old brushes for painting fur. This bristle fan brush is perfect for the job, as its bristles are splayed apart and able to communicate individual hairs. Working wet into wet, I soften my edges and check my tones. Moving on to our little Bichon Horace, I'm trying to avoid painting individual hairs. Rather, I'm identifying clumps of hair and painting them as one mass, and then separating these masses with darker tones. Once paint is applied in broad strokes, I can then move areas of paint one into the other, blending across zones. This has formed a pretty loose base, and I feel like I need to move into a little bit of detail while the paint's still wet. Finer adjustments can be made by just touching the end of the brush to the painting and dragging various colors through. Also applying a very small amount of color, like in this case burnt umber and ultramarine blue to deepen the tone, can be great for separating individual areas of fur. Now that my painting's been roughed out and some areas have been detailed, I do feel it's missing something. Rungus, in the studio, trying to match the exact light angle so that he's part of the scene. In white and quinacridone magenta to sketch out the outline of Rungus. Because I want my colors to coordinate across this painting, I'm going to be using the exact same palette for Rungus that I've used for Jesse and Horace. This time it's more heavily laden with titanium white, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna, with ultramarine blue and burnt umber forming the basis for the shadows. To achieve a little bit more red, I've used quinacridone magenta. I'm working with about 3 or 4 different angle wedge brushes at once, so that my colors don't get too muddy. Like with any portrait, the positioning of the eyes and the nose are absolutely critical to getting an animal's character. Wet paint can be adjusted back and forth, and edges can be redefined and blended in with one another to achieve a soft effect. I'm holding back with my tones, muting them on purpose so that I can achieve a real light effect towards the end of the process. Individual hairs can be feathered out with just the edge of a wedge brush. Finally, I adjust my warm and cool tones to achieve a little bit of a sculptural effect. I've only allowed myself about 6 hours for this painting, which has forced me to loosen up with my technique somewhat. Using oleo gel as my medium, it's really helped me blend one area of color into another to achieve a really soft and sculptural effect. This is the best way that I know how to honor my furry friends, and hopefully you've come away with a few new techniques.